Chief Mate Oscar Pell jabbed a finger toward the galley hatch and told cook Yara Stroud to get back where she belonged, his voice cutting over the clang of steel pots while the gray swells of open ocean rolled past the portholes of the MSV Halyard Sound. 90 minutes later, 12 armed men in stolen coveralls came up a rope ladder out of the dark and pressed a rifle to the bridge watch officer's throat, and not one of them knew yet that the woman they had just locked in the galley was the only reason their hijacking was already finished. It was a small thing, the way Pell said it. He didn't shout. He never had to. He was the kind of officer who could make 4 words sound like a verdict, and he'd been saying some version of them to her for 11 months, ever since she'd stepped aboard the Halyard Sound with a sea bag, a set of knives she kept sharper than anyone on the ship thought a cook needed to, and a service record that had been quietly, deliberately, thinned down to nothing more than a rating and a date of enlistment. Culinary specialist, 2nd class, Yara Stroud. That was the whole story, as far as Pell was concerned, and as far as he was concerned, it was a short one. She'd been standing in the passageway outside the wardroom with a tray of coffee mugs when he found some reason to be annoyed with her. A schedule she hadn't confirmed, a delivery she hadn't chased down fast enough. It didn't matter which. It was never really about the thing itself. And he'd said it the way he always did, loud enough for the 2 junior engineers walking past to hear. Get back in the galley, get back in the... As if the rest of the ship were a place she had wandered into by accident. As if a woman who fed 24 souls 3 times a day in a kitchen the size of a delivery van had nothing to offer a vessel that also, on paper, needed watchstanders and lookouts and hands on the rails. She hadn't said anything back. She rarely did. She'd taken the tray into the wardroom, set the mugs down without spilling a drop despite the 4-foot swell running under the hull, and gone back to her galley, because arguing with Oscar Pell had never once, in 11 months, been worth the breath. What he didn't know, what nobody on the Halyard Sound knew, not Master Elmore Gant who signed her rating book, not the wide-eyed 20-year-old ordinary seaman who ate her eggs every morning like they were the best thing that had ever happened to him, not one soul aboard. Was that Yara Stroud had spent 6 years before this ship doing work that would have made Pell's voice die in his throat if he'd ever seen a single after-action report with her name blacked out of it. She had left the teams the quiet way. No retirement ceremony, no folded flag, no farewell dinner with people who understood what the silences meant. She had simply finished a contract, put in for separation, and gone to sea on the civilian side of the fleet, where nobody asked why a woman with combat reflexes wanted to spend her days portioning eggs and running a walk-in cooler inventory. The ocean didn't ask questions. The ocean just rolled, the same gray Atlantic swell it had been rolling since before there were ships to carry across it. And for the first time in a long time, Yara had found something close to peace in the rhythm of it. Up at 400, bread proofing by 4:30, breakfast on the line by 5:30, and a whole ship's worth of routine that asked nothing of her except to feed it well. Before the Halyard Sound, before the apron and the walk-in and the daily litany of get back in the galley, she had belonged to a small, quiet interagency maritime interdiction cell that most of the surface fleet had never heard the real name of, an outfit that trained aboard borrowed hulls up and down the coast and specialized in exactly the kind of problem she would face tonight. Vessels seized by force, crews held below decks, and a clock that never once cared how tired the operator sent to fix it happened to be. She had earned the call sign Riptide during a training exercise in her 2nd year, after an instructor watched her clear a mocked-up superstructure alone in the dark and told the debrief room, half in admiration and half in warning, that she pulled a target under before he ever realized he was in trouble. It was the kind of nickname that followed a person quietly through an entire career, and then, when the career ended the way hers had, followed nobody at all, because nobody left to use it. She was good at hiding, was the truth of it. She had trained for exactly that once in a life she didn't talk about. And she had gotten so good at disappearing into the galley that even she sometimes forgot, for whole weeks at a time, that the rest of her hadn't gone anywhere at all. The crew she fed 3 times a day knew a woman who remembered how everyone took their coffee, who kept a tin of ginger candy for anyone fighting seasickness, who never once raised her voice even when a dropped tray sent hot grease across her forearm. And none of them, not even Benji Odom, who ate breakfast across from her most mornings and considered her something close to a friend, had ever once looked at her hands and wondered what else they might be capable of. The Halyard Sound was 11 days into a resupply run through the Kestrel Strait, hauling 400 tons of forward-base cargo, fuel bladders, spare turbine parts, crated communications gear worth more on a grey market than most of the crew would earn in a decade, toward a logistics hub that existed on no tourist map. She was a big, unglamorous, grey-hulled auxiliary under the flag of the Fleet Auxiliary Service, crewed by 24 hands, armed with nothing heavier than a couple of locked, small-arms lockers that Master Gant hadn't opened in 3 years, and moving at a steady 14 knots through water that had, until that evening, felt like the safest place in the world. Every hand aboard had sat through the same standard anti-piracy briefing at the start of the voyage. Muster points, a Citadel procedure nobody had ever actually rehearsed under pressure. A reminder to report anything unusual on radar past dusk. And every hand aboard had filed it away the way sailors file away drills for emergencies that only ever happened to somebody else's ship. Dusk came down thick with a low sea fog that night, the kind that swallowed running lights past 200 yards, and it was in that fog, at 1758, that a low, dark-hulled fishing boat, with its engine throttled back to a whisper, came alongside the Halyard Sound's stern quarter, riding low and quiet, in a blind spot the watch officer wouldn't have caught even with a clear sky. 12 men went up a weighted rope ladder in under 90 seconds, moving with the flat, practiced efficiency of people who had done this before, dressed in stolen ship's coveralls that let them pass for one critical minute as crew returning from an exterior maintenance round. Dragan Sarek came up last, unhurried, already giving orders in a low voice before his boots hit the deck plates. He was not a man who yelled. He didn't need to. He had run 2 hijackings before this one, both successful, both quiet enough that the names never made it past a shipping insurance database, and he had built his whole operation on a simple principle: speed to the bridge, control of the one place that mattered, and a clock that favored him. 12 men were more than enough, by his count, to take a lightly defended auxiliary with no armed security detachment aboard, and he had studied the Halyard Sound's transit schedule for 3 weeks before choosing this particular stretch of fog-bound water to make his move. They hit the bridge at 18:04. 2 men through the port door, 2 through starboard, Sarek through the center with a rifle already up, and it was over in the time it took Chief Mate Oscar Pell, who had the evening watch, to draw one full breath. A rifle muzzle found his throat before he'd finished turning around. Behind him, the second watch officer went down onto her knees, with her hands laced behind her head. And somewhere in the radio room, 1 deck below, a junior operator got exactly 4 words of a distress call out: "Halyard Sound, we are," before a boarder's boot came down on the transmitter, and a fist came down on him, and the compartment went dark and silent, and the only ship in 1,400 nautical miles that knew anything at all had heard 4 words and a burst of static, and then nothing. Sarek's men worked the superstructure with the same practiced calm they'd shown coming up the ladder, sweeping cabin after cabin, herding anyone they found toward the main passageway, with short, clipped orders in accented English: no wasted motion, no wasted shouting. It was, by the brutal standards of the trade Sarek had built his life around, a textbook boarding, fast, quiet, and complete inside of 6 minutes, with every visible soul on the Halyard Sound accounted for, and marched toward a single holding point before most of them had fully understood what was happening to their ship. Cargo manifests are not, ordinarily, the kind of document that gets a ship hijacked, but the Halyard Sound's manifest that voyage listed a line item that had made her a target long before she ever entered the Kestrel Strait. A sealed shipment of precision navigation modules bound for a forward logistics hub, small enough to move fast on a black market, and valuable enough that a buyer with the right connections would pay in cash and ask no questions about how they had left military custody. Sarek had not planned this hijacking on instinct. He had bought the manifest from a corrupt port clerk 3 weeks earlier, cross-checked the Halyard Sound's transit schedule against known patrol patterns in the strait, and picked this particular stretch of fog-bound water with the same cold precision he brought to everything else, confident that a ship this size, moving this predictably, with no armed escort and no history of trouble, represented exactly the kind of low-risk, high-value target his operation depended on. Master Elmore Gant was hauled up to his own bridge in his undershirt, marched at gunpoint from his cabin 2 decks below, and made to stand in the one place he had commanded for 11 years, while a stranger with a calm voice and cold eyes explained, in accented but precise terms, exactly how the next 14 hours were going to go. Sarek did not threaten wildly. That was almost the worst part, Gant would think later. The flat, businesslike patience of it. Sarek wanted the ship's course altered to a rendezvous point 91 nautical miles to the southeast, where a second vessel would take on the cargo, and likely some portion of the crew as additional leverage. He wanted no distress traffic, no altered running lights, no deviation from a normal watch schedule that any passing patrol aircraft might notice from altitude. And he wanted it understood, without ambiguity, that any resistance from the crew would be met with consequences visited on whichever of them happened to be standing closest. 22 of the Halyard Sound's 24 souls were rounded up within 11 minutes and marched down to the crew mess, a low, windowless compartment 2 decks below the main deck that made an efficient holding pen. 1 door, no portholes, easily watched by 2 men with rifles, while the rest of Sarek's crew fanned out to secure the engineering spaces, the radio room, and the 2 remaining access ladders that connected the superstructure to the working deck. Among the 22 was ordinary seaman Benji Odom, 20 years old, 6 months out of training and still young enough that his hands shook visibly as he sat down on the deck plates where he was told, staring at the rifle 4 feet from his face like he could somehow will it to be something else. Master Gant, forced to stand at the front of that same compartment before Sarek pulled him back up to the bridge, had done a quiet head count of his own without moving his lips, and come up 2 short, and said nothing, and hoped very hard that, whatever the reason for it, turned out to be a good one. 2 hands were unaccounted for at the 11-minute mark, and it was the kind of detail that would have mattered to a more careful operator than the 2 guards Sarek had posted on the mess hall door, a junior engineer working alone in a remote pump room who simply hadn't been found yet, and cook Yara Stroud, who had been standing in the walk-in cooler at 1804 doing inventory on a case of frozen chicken and had heard the boots and the shouting through the ventilation duct with the particular clarity of someone whose ears had once been trained, professionally, to separate the sound of a boarding action from every other sound a hull could make. She did not open the cooler door for 6 full minutes. She stood in the cold with her hand flat against the steel, breathing slow, running the same calculation she had run 100 times in a different life. How many voices? What accents? What weapons by the cadence of the footsteps overhead? How many decks between her position and the bridge? 12 distinct sets of boots, by her count, moving with too much coordination to be anything but trained. A rifle butt striking a deck plate somewhere above. A warning shot at nothing, meant only to be heard. And underneath all of it, the low, unbroken thrum of the ship's own engines, still running, still making way, which told her the one fact that mattered most. Whoever had just taken this ship intended to sail it somewhere, on a clock, before anyone came looking. She did the arithmetic the way she'd been taught to, brutal and exact. A distress call, even a fragmentary one, might have gotten a position fix out before it died. Might. If it had, The nearest naval response asset she knew of working this strait was a frigate on independent patrol some 600 nautical miles to the northwest, which put a realistic intercept, accounting for spin-up time, transit speed, and the launch window for an air asset once they were close enough, somewhere around 14 hours out. 14 hours was a number she could work with. 91 nautical miles to a rendezvous point at the Halyard Sound's cruising speed of 14 knots. Was not. That was 6.5 hours, which meant Sarek's ship would reach open water, and a waiting buyer with the crew and the cargo, both long before any help arrived. Nobody was coming in time. If the Halyard Sound reached that rendezvous, 22 people below decks became a bargaining chip. Nobody in a position of power was going to spend a war fixing, and the ship itself, along with everything and everyone still aboard her, would belong to whoever showed up to collect it. The cooler door was heavy, insulated, silent on its hinges. She opened it 2 inches, listened, and stepped out into her galley for what she understood, with total clarity, would be the last time she wore an apron for a while. She moved fast after that, but never in a straight line, and never toward anywhere a guard would expect a cook to go. The Halyard Sound had been Yara's ship for 11 months, and in that time she had done something none of the deck officers who outranked her had bothered to do. She had walked every accessible space of the hull, more than once, memorizing it the way she used to memorize buildings and compounds in a life she never mentioned at the mess table. She knew the escape trunks, the narrow vertical shafts, barely shoulder width, that connected the engineering spaces straight up through 3 decks to emergency scuttles on the weather deck, designed so a crew could evacuate a flooding or fire-choked engine room without ever using the main ladder wells. She knew the ladder wells themselves, which ones squealed and which didn't, which compartments had a second, unmarked access nobody used because it was faster to go around. She knew where the void spaces sat between the double-bottom tanks, cramped and dark and utterly useless to anyone who hadn't spent hours down there with a flashlight out of nothing but restless habit. And she knew, better than any officer who had only ever seen the ship's drawings in a folder, exactly which watertight doors could be dogged shut from one side to turn an entire passageway into a trap for anyone unlucky enough to be standing in it. Her route to the first escape trunk carried her past the crew berthing spaces, dark and abandoned now, bunks left unmade, exactly as their owners had left them that morning. And for one brief moment she let herself slow at the open door of the compartment she shared with 2 other ratings, long enough to see the small photograph taped inside her own locker door, herself and a woman with graying hair on a porch somewhere far from any ocean, the last picture anyone had taken of her before she'd shipped out. And to understand, with total clarity, exactly what she stood to lose if the math she'd just run turned out to be wrong. She did not linger. She closed the door as quietly as she had opened it and kept moving, because there would be time to feel any of this later, and right now there were 22 people whose survival depended on her not being late. She shed her whites in the dry store's locker behind the galley and pulled on a set of dark engineering coveralls she'd kept there, unremarked, for exactly this kind of contingency she had told herself for 11 months she would never actually need. She took nothing that looked like a weapon, because she knew from hard experience that a weapon in an amateur's hands is a liability, and in a trained hand is still, first and always, a last resort. What she took was a coil of paracord, a roll of heavy tape, a small multi-tool, and the 2 flashlights she used every night to check the walk-in seals, because darkness, she knew better than anyone aboard, was the single greatest asset an outnumbered operator could hold on a ship this size. Her first target wasn't a person. It was the ship itself. Every hour the Halyard Sound kept making 14 knots toward that rendezvous point was an hour working against the 22 people locked in the mess hall, and there was exactly one place aboard where a single person, moving alone and unseen, could change that math entirely. The engine control room, 3 decks down, where the machinery plant that gave this ship its speed and its steering could be shut down from the inside faster than anyone topside could stop it. Sarek had 12 men to control a ship with dozens of compartments, kilometers of passageway, and a hull that had never been designed with an intruder in mind. He had posted guards on the bridge, the radio room, and the mess hall door, and sent 2 more prowling the exterior decks, which left the beating mechanical heart of the vessel 3 decks down in the heat and noise, watched by exactly 1 man, who had never in his life expected the ship's own cook to come for him in the dark. She reached the first escape trunk hatch behind the dry stores locker at 18:26, 22 minutes after the boarding began, and dropped into it without a sound. The engine room of the Halyard Sound was a cathedral of noise and heat, 2 full decks of turbines and generators and shafting running at a steady, deafening roar that had always struck Yara, on the rare occasions duty sent her down there to sign for stores, as the one place aboard where a person could disappear completely inside the sound alone. That same roar worked for her now. She came out of the escape trunk into a mezzanine catwalk above the main engineering space, flattened against a bulkhead in the deep shadow between 2 overhead light fixtures, and took 40 seconds just to watch. 1 guard, young, restless, holding his rifle with the stiff unfamiliarity of a man who had been handed engine room duty because Sarek needed bodies posted everywhere, and this was the space nobody expected trouble from. He was pacing a slow circuit around the main control console, glancing at gauges he plainly didn't understand, and every 90 seconds or so, his path carried him past a narrow gap between the number 2 generator housing and a bank of electrical panels, a gap just wide enough for a body to fold into, and just dark enough that a person already inside it, already still, already breathing on the guard's own rhythm to mask the sound, would be functionally invisible. She let him pass that gap twice before she moved. The third time, the roar of the machinery swallowed everything. The half-step forward, the hand that closed over his mouth before he could turn his head. The controlled, silent fall backward into the shadow of the generator housing that no one topside would hear over the turbines, even if they'd been standing in the same compartment. It was over in 4 seconds. He never got a shout out, never got a shot off, and when Yara rolled him onto his stomach and had his wrists lashed with paracord and his mouth taped a moment later, he was already coming back to full awareness in a world where his rifle belonged to someone else, and his ankle was zip-tied to a fixed pipe fitting that wasn't going anywhere. She dragged him into the tool locker off the main catwalk, wedged the hatch with a length of pipe that would take real effort to force from the inside, and moved to the control console, with 11 minutes gone and 11 hijackers left topside, who had no idea yet that their count was already wrong. The engine control console was not complicated to a woman who had spent a career learning how machines failed, only complicated to someone who'd never had a reason to look closely at it before. She isolated the main propulsion control, walked the shaft brake through its sequence, and secured the local machinery control panel with a padlock she'd lifted, on impulse, from a tool cabinet, a small, almost petty piece of insurance that would cost anyone topside real time, even if they figured out where the failure had come from. For good measure, she killed the transfer switch that would have let the bridge take remote command of propulsion at all, so that even if Sarek's men found a way to force the console, the order would have nowhere left to go. The great turbines wound down. The deep vibration that had lived in every deck plate of the Halyard Sound for 11 days simply stopped, replaced by a silence so total it felt, for a moment, like the ship itself was holding its breath. On the bridge, Dragan Sarek felt the change in his boots before anyone said a word. He crossed to the helm console in 3 strides and found the propulsion telegraph reading a dead flat 0, the rudder unresponsive, the whole enormous vessel beginning, almost imperceptibly, to lose way and settle broadside into the swell. He keyed his radio to the engine room and got static. And then, after a longer silence than he liked, nothing at all. He sent 2 men down to investigate, and both of them found nothing on the mezzanine but a locked tool locker they had no key for, and a control panel secured behind a padlock that hadn't been there an hour earlier. And neither of them thought to look closely enough at the shadow between the number 2 generator housing and the electrical panels to notice it had, very recently, held a person. For the first time since he had come up that rope ladder, Dragon Sarek felt something he was not used to feeling on a job, the small, cold suspicion that the numbers on this ship might not add up the way he had counted them at 1758. He ordered a head count over the handheld radios he'd distributed to his crew, a simple roll-by-number that any of his men could answer with a single word. And when the count came back short, 2 men silent, a third slow enough to answer that Sarek had already started running through explanations before the reply finally crackled through. He understood, faster than he wanted to, that this was not a mechanical failure at all. He said nothing to the 2 watch officers standing frozen near the chart table, and nothing to Master Gant, who was watching his face with the careful, unreadable patience of a man who had spent 11 years reading weather off the horizon and had just started reading something else entirely off the man holding him hostage. She freed Benji Odom's friend from engineering first. The young second-shift oiler who'd been trapped alone in a remote pump room since the boarding began, too far from the mess hall muster to be swept up with the others, and used him for exactly 90 seconds, long enough to confirm the mess hall's guard rotation, before sending him into the same tool locker with the first hijacker, safer there than anywhere else on a drifting, darkened ship. Then she started working her way toward the 22 people who mattered most, moving deck by deck, compartment by compartment, through passageways she had memorized on nights when insomnia and old habit sent her walking instead of sleeping. The engine room's silence had done something to Sarek's men that no rifle could have. Word moved fast among his crew that the ship had lost power on its own, with no explanation, and small groups of hardened men who had walked onto this vessel with total confidence an hour earlier were now checking corners they hadn't bothered to check before. That instinct, ironically, made them easier to isolate. Men who split off in pairs to search unfamiliar compartments were men who eventually, inevitably, split into ones. And Yara had spent 6 years of her life turning exactly that kind of mistake into an opponent's last one. The second hijacker she took in a laundry compartment on the crew deck, a small man sent alone to check a noise that had, in fact, been nothing more than Yara deliberately dropping a loose fitting down a scuttle 2 decks away to draw him off his post. He came through the hatch with his rifle up and his flashlight sweeping, and the darkness did the rest of the work for her. A low sweep that took his legs out from under him before the light ever found her. A knee that pinned his shoulder before he'd finished falling. And hands, fast and certain, that had his wrists bound and his weapon stripped away before the confusion on his face had time to become anything else. 9 minutes later, he was zip-tied to a pipe in the same laundry compartment with his own coveralls, stuffed as a makeshift gag, and Yara was already 3 ladder wells away, moving on. The third came almost by accident, and it was the one that came closest to going wrong. She had been working her way aft along a narrow crew passageway when a hijacker stepped out of a berthing compartment directly into her path, with no warning at all, close enough that there was no room for the quiet, patient setup she preferred. No shadow to wait in, no noise to lure him toward, just 6 feet of lit passageway, and a man whose rifle was already swinging up. She closed the distance before he could bring it fully to bear, got a hand on the barrel, and drove it toward the deck as his finger found the trigger guard rather than the trigger, and the 2 of them went down together against a steel bulkhead in a scramble that made real, audible noise for the first time all night. A grunt, a boot scraping deck plate, the dull clang of a rifle stock striking steel. She had him bound inside 20 seconds, breathing hard for the first time since 1804, and stayed motionless in the dark passageway afterward for a full minute, listening for footsteps that this time did not come. It was the closest the whole night came to teaching her something about herself she thought she'd already learned years earlier, that even the best prepared plan cannot account for a stranger simply opening a door at the wrong moment, and that surviving that kind of accident took the same steady nerve as any of the parts she had actually planned. She reached the mess hall at 1902 and did not go through the door. She went instead to the ventilation access above the compartment, a route she'd used exactly once before, on a bored afternoon 3 months earlier, chasing a jammed damper that had been driving the whole crew mess crazy with a rattling noise at dinner. From the duct, she could see both guards on the door, and through the mess hall's small interior window, 22 frightened, exhausted faces sitting on the deck in neat, terrified rows. She found Benji Odom's face in the crowd, saw the particular way he kept glancing at the door like he was counting his own remaining minutes, and made herself a promise she intended to keep before the night was over. She did not free the mess hall yet. 2 guards on one door with clear sightlines to 22 hostages was not a fight she could win cleanly from a duct, and a clean fight was the only kind she planned on having tonight. No shots fired near the people she was trying to save. No chaos that let a cornered man do something desperate to a hostage before she could stop him. Instead, she went for the radio room, where a guard, alone since his usual escort had been pulled to reinforce the increasingly nervous search parties combing the drifting ship, was sitting with his rifle across his knees and his attention split uselessly between the dead consoles and the darkness outside the porthole. He went down the same way the others had. Silence, surprise, 4 seconds of controlled violence that left him zip-tied to the leg of a bolted console with no memory of exactly what had happened to him, and a functioning distress transmitter that Yara restored to life with hands that hadn't touched a piece of emergency comms gear in 3 years and remembered every step anyway. She keyed it once, gave a compressed, disciplined position report and situation summary in a voice pitched low enough not to carry past the hatch. Halyard Sound, hijacked at approximately 1804, 12 hostiles aboard, 4 neutralized, 22 crew held in the forward mess. Request expedited naval response, and shut it down again before any answering transmission could risk drawing attention to the compartment. Somewhere 600 nautical miles to the northwest, a communications watch officer aboard a frigate already steaming hard on a fragmentary earlier signal sat up straight in his chair and started running numbers of his own, and within minutes, a helicopter crew that had been resting between patrol legs was being told to plan for an early launch instead of a late dinner. 4 hijackers down, 8 left, and Dragan Sarek, 3 decks above, was starting to understand that whatever was happening on his ship was not sabotage from a panicked engineer. It was hunting. Sarek pulled his remaining men back toward the bridge and the mess hall in a tighter formation after the 4th guard failed to report, no longer willing to spread bodies thin across a ship that seemed to be swallowing them one at a time. He was not a man who scared easily, and he told himself, pacing the darkened bridge with the useless helm in front of him, that this was still explainable. A hidden security team, maybe. A naval liaison officer he hadn't accounted for. Someone the shipping company had quietly embedded and never logged. What he refused to consider, because it did not fit anything he understood about ships like this one, was the truth standing 3 decks below him, with a coil of paracord and a stolen rifle she had no intention of firing unless every other option ran out. He kept 6 men close around the bridge and the mess hall door, and sent 2 more reluctantly to sweep the lower decks together, in a pair this time, rifles up, moving slow. It was the correct instinct, arriving too late. Yara had already used the ship's own geography against every previous hijacker alone. 2 men moving together through a passageway barely wide enough for one was, if anything, an easier problem, because a passageway that narrow meant the second man could never bring his weapon to bear around the first, and a ladder well above them meant she didn't need to meet them on their own deck at all. She dropped a length of loose cable down a scuttle above the passageway they were sweeping, timed to the second, and in the half-beat of confusion that followed, two trained men flinching toward an unexplained sound, instead of watching each other's flank. She came down through the scuttle behind the rearmost of them, put him on the deck before his partner had finished turning, and had the second man's rifle wrenched sideways and useless by the time he understood the shape of what had happened to him. Neither shot was fired. Neither man got out more than a grunt of surprise before her weight and her hands, and 11 months of quiet, unglamorous physical work in a ship's galley, carrying flour sacks, hauling cases of frozen meat, hours on her feet every single day that had kept a trained body sharp without anyone once suspecting why, put them both in sequence, face down and bound on cold steel deck plating. 6 down, 6 left, and every one of them now standing close enough to Sarek that he could see, for the first time, the particular quality of fear that had nothing to do with him. He made his mistake at 1947, and it was the same mistake every cornered man in his position eventually makes. He decided the fastest way to draw his unseen enemy into the open was to threaten someone she might care about. He had a man drag Benji Odom out of the mess hall by the collar, out into the passageway where the security camera he didn't know was dead could theoretically have seen it, and put a rifle to the young seaman's temple, and had another of his men shout down the passageway into the dark that the ship's saboteur, whatever they were, had exactly 2 minutes to show themselves, or the boy died first, with the rest of the mess hall to follow. Yara had been 3 compartments away when she heard it, close enough that the 2 minutes felt like a country mile, and far enough that a straight run would have cost her the surprise that was the only real weapon she had left. She didn't run in a straight line. She went the way she'd gone all night, up through a ladder well Sarek's remaining men didn't know existed, along a catwalk above the passageway where Benji Odom stood shaking with a rifle at his temple, and a hijacker's shout still echoing off the steel bulkheads, and she came down on top of the man holding the rifle from directly above him, with every ounce of controlled silent violence she had left in her, because a life she had promised to save was standing 4 feet away, and the 2 minutes Sarek had offered were never going to matter, because she had already stopped counting on his terms an hour ago. The rifle came free of the hijacker's hands before his body had finished folding under her. Benji Odom staggered backward against the bulkhead, gasping, and found himself staring at a woman he had eaten breakfast across from every single morning for 11 months, dressed now in dark coveralls with a bound and unconscious man at her feet, and eyes that had gone somewhere he had never once seen them go over a plate of eggs. She didn't stop to explain. She pressed a finger to her lips, pulled him bodily into the shadow of the ladder well, and told him, in a low, level voice that carried absolute certainty, to stay down and stay quiet and trust that this was almost over. It was. 2 more of Sarek's men, sent to find the source of the commotion, walked into a darkened passageway they never came back out of the way they'd walked in, and by 2011, Yara Stroud stood at the base of the bridge ladder, with 11 of Dragon Sarek's 12 men accounted for, bound in compartments across a ship that was, for the first time in over 2 hours, entirely and quietly hers again. Sarek was alone on his own bridge when she came through the door, standing over Master Elmore Gant and the 2 watch officers he'd kept as his last insurance, and for one long moment the 2 of them simply looked at each other across a darkened compartment lit only by the faint blue glow of a dead instrument panel. A hijacker who had run out of men to hide behind, and a ship's cook who had spent the last 2 hours proving, compartment by compartment, exactly how badly he had miscounted his odds at 1758. He raised his rifle and she was already inside the arc of it, and the fight that followed lasted 11 seconds and ended with Dragon Sarek zip-tied to his own helm console, disarmed, disoriented, and utterly unable to explain to himself how a single crew member had unraveled 12 armed men without firing a single shot in anger the whole night. By 2020, every hijacker aboard the Halyard Sound was restrained and accounted for. The crew was out of the mess hall and helping Master Gant take inventory of a ship that had drifted 11 nautical miles off her original course during the ordeal, and Yara Stroud stood on her own bridge in borrowed coveralls with paracord burns on her palms, looking, for the first time in 11 months, exactly like what she actually was. Gant got the engines answering again within the hour, once Yara walked one of his engineers through the padlocked panel herself, and the Halyard Sound turned back onto her original heading under her own power. A little after 2100, 12 hijackers zip-tied in a neat, silent row in the same crew mess that had held 22 frightened people 3 hours earlier. The frigate's helicopter came in low over a grey, calm dawn at 0742, 11.5 hours after that first fragmentary distress call, and roughly 6 hours after Yara's compressed radio report had given the response force a far more useful picture to plan around. The boarding team fast roped onto the Halyard Sound's weather deck in full kit, weapons up, moving with the brisk, coiled tension of a unit expecting to fight for every compartment of a hijacked vessel, and found instead 12 hijackers lined up zip-tied against a bulkhead under guard, a crew standing calmly at their stations, and a ship's cook in dark coveralls, with dried blood at her knuckles, standing quietly to one side, letting Master Gant do the talking. It was the team leader, a lieutenant named Dax Farrow, who stopped cold 3 steps onto that deck and looked twice at the woman standing near the bridge ladder before his professional composure caught up with his memory. He'd seen that face before, 18 months earlier, at a classified joint interdiction exercise where a small maritime counter-terrorism cell had run his own unit through a training scenario so thoroughly that half his team still brought it up as a cautionary tale. And the operator who'd taken his entire simulated boarding party apart that week, working alone, in the dark, without ever raising her voice, had gone by a call sign nobody in that room had ever heard attached to a real name: Riptide. "You've got to be kidding me," Farrow said, and then, without waiting for confirmation, without needing it, he turned to his own stick of 6 operators standing behind him with their weapons still half raised, and gave the order that told the whole ship, in one gesture, exactly who had actually retaken it. He had every one of them stand to and render a formal salute, right there on the open deck of a drifting auxiliary ship, to a culinary specialist second class who, 12 hours earlier, had been told to get back in the galley. Master Elmore Gant logged it himself, in his own hand, in the ship's official record, before the frigate's medical team had even finished checking the crew. Cook Yara Stroud, acting security officer, for extraordinary actions in the retaking of MSV Halyard Sound from 12 armed hijackers. It was not a ceremony. It was 4 lines in a logbook, and it was, to Yara, worth more than any medal she had ever quietly declined to wear in a previous life, because it was the first time in 11 months that anyone aboard this ship had written down, in ink that would outlast every one of them, exactly what she was capable of. Chief Mate Oscar Pell found her an hour later on the weather deck, where she was helping the frigate's corpsman check on Benji Odom, who would not stop talking, in a giddy, adrenaline-shaken rush, about the woman who had come down out of a ladder, well, like something out of a story he wasn't sure anyone would believe. Pell didn't say much. He didn't have much of anything to say, for possibly the first time in the 11 months Yara had known him, and what he did instead was set a steaming mug of coffee into her bound-up, rope-burned hands, exactly the way she had set 100 trays down in front of him without a word, and stood there a moment before he finally managed, low and stiff and entirely sincere, that he owed her an apology he didn't know how to make properly yet, and would she let him try. The Halyard Sound made port under her own power 4 days later, escorted the last leg by the same frigate whose helicopter had found her drifting and secure at dawn, and the story of what had happened in the Kestrel Strait moved through the wider fleet, the way stories like that always do. Quietly at first, in radio traffic and quiet debriefs, then less quietly, until there wasn't a mess deck in the service that hadn't heard some version of how a ship's cook had taken back an entire vessel from 12 armed men without losing a single life. Investigators came aboard, took statements, filed reports that would sit in a classified folder for exactly as long as the service decided they needed to, and Dragan Sarek and his 11 men went ashore in restraints to answer for a hijacking that had failed so completely and so quietly that none of them, even months later, could fully reconstruct how it had happened to them in real time. Lieutenant Farrow's own after-action report, filed 2 days later, contained a single line that would follow Yara Stroud around the fleet almost as persistently as her old call sign. That the boarding team had arrived, prepared to retake a hijacked vessel, and instead found one that had already, in every meaningful sense, retaken itself. Yara Stroud was offered a great many things in the weeks that followed. A formal commendation ceremony she declined as gently as she could manage. Interview requests from people who wanted to turn her into a headline she had no interest in becoming. A standing offer to transfer into a shore-based security billet where her particular skills would be, on paper, more fully utilized. She turned all of it down, politely and without much explanation, because the truth she had learned a long time ago, and relearned in the loudest possible way aboard the Halyard Sound, was that she had never actually needed anyone else's permission to be exactly who she already was. She didn't need the title to be capable of using it. She had simply needed, for one long, dark 14-hour stretch, to be trusted with it. And now that she had been, she found she didn't much care whether anyone kept calling her by it afterward. She was back in her galley 3 mornings after the Halyard Sound made port, up at 0400, with bread proofing by 0430, and breakfast on the line by 0530, same as always, except that the line moved a little differently now. Benji Odom showed up 10 minutes early most mornings just to talk. Not about the hijacking mostly, just to talk, the way you do with someone who has quietly become the person you trust most on a ship. Chief Mate Oscar Pell started eating breakfast standing at the pass, instead of sending a junior rating to fetch his tray, which everyone aboard understood, without anyone ever saying it out loud, was as close to an ongoing apology as the man was ever going to manage, and which Yara accepted every morning with nothing more than a nod and an extra spoonful of the good eggs. Word got around the fleet eventually, in the low-key way these things do among people who actually cook and actually eat at sea, that the Halyard Sound ran the best galley on the water, not because anyone made a production of it, but because a woman who had once kept 12 armed men from ever finding their footing aboard a ship she loved had decided quietly that feeding 24 people well every single day was its own kind of vigilance worth keeping. She was at the griddle again at 500 most mornings within a month. Same apron, same steady hands, same unhurried competence that had always been sitting there in plain sight the whole time, waiting for anyone to actually look. Master Elmore Gant still keeps that logbook entry in his own handwriting, and he tells anyone who asks, cadets, new hands, the occasional visiting officer who's heard some fragment of the story and wants to know if it's true, that the most dangerous person aboard any ship he has ever commanded was the one everyone assumed was the least. He tells them to remember that the next time somebody tells a capable person to get back in their place, because on his ship, on one particular night in the Kestrel Strait, the galley turned out to be exactly where the fight was won. If a story like this one is worth your time, the best thing you can do is hit like and subscribe, because it genuinely helps a channel like this one keep finding the underestimated ones and telling their stories right. And down in the comments, tell me honestly, if you'd been locked in that mess hall with 21 other frightened people, not knowing a single soul aboard, was quietly taking the ship back compartment by compartment in the dark, would you have believed help was coming? Or would you have assumed, like everyone always assumed about Yara Stroud, that the person who could actually save you was somebody else entirely.